There is no offseason. Welcome to the College Football Insiders. I am Brendan Marcello, joined today by Chris Hummer and John Taltu. We got a national championship under our belt. Indiana, the first 16-0 champion we've ever had in the FBS in this modern era. And who would have thought this could have happened? I know Steve Sarkisian knew it would never happen. And what do you think of that, Chris? Texas's head coach saying there would never be another undefeated champion.
I mean, his production did hold up for what, like 9 months? That's pretty good.
That's not
You know,
bad.
like,
In this day and
yeah.
age, 9 months is an eternity.
Brandon, I saw that you and I had to do in a thing like a fact or fiction off of Sarkisian's prediction, and you and I both went fact.
I know.
We
Don't
it
don't
made
bring
sense to
that
me that
up.
there wouldn't be one.
Yeah, and who? Yeah, and it's Indiana of all people. Can you imagine 9 months ago? Go back in time, going, you guys are so wrong. In fact, you're so wrong. Indiana is going to be that first one. It's going to happen in 9 months. I would have walked out the room. Okay, so that's not the big story here. That's in the past, and we're always looking to the future here. In Miami, the Hurricanes are looking to the future after being the national runner-up against Indiana. They're in their own backyard, but man, they're celebrating today in Coral Gables. They land Duke quarterback transfer Darian Mensah just a few hours after he was able to enroll at his school, was able to enter the transfer portal. The Duke quarterback, of course, was able to lead the Blue Devils to the ACC championship where they won the game. And this is a guy who's just absolutely electric as a passer, throwing for more than 3,000 yards in each of the last two seasons, first at Tulane and now at Duke. And you're seeing the numbers up there. Incredible. 3,973 yards, ranking first there in the FBS. And the pass touchdowns, the completion percentage, all elite. And now Miami gets their signal caller yet again, going to a program that has been in their conference championship game, maybe hasn't quite been able to get to the, a national championship type picture. Duke obviously being different from what Carson Beck was there at Georgia, but two quarterbacks that have so much production, so much elite production that this just seems to fit the mold completely for the Hurricanes. Now, that all aside, guys, how did this happen? Why did it happen? Take us to the beginning.
Well, I'll start. We reported the morning the portal closed, essentially, that Duke had concerns that Darian Mensah could enter the transfer portal. At that point, Darian Mensah in his camp, he is repped by Young Money, the agency, not the Lil Wayne backed rap organization. Had essentially cut off communication with Duke for about a 24-hour period. Duke had begun to worry that Mensah could force his way into the portal despite having a record-setting 2-year, $8 million contract. And ultimately, that's what he did. He opted to enter the transfer portal. He submitted his name to Duke. Duke did not want to submit it to the point where Duke filed a lawsuit against Darian Mensah, essentially for breach of contract. The legal stuff here is a little more complicated and probably too much to get into here. But basically, Duke sued Darian Mensah. The two sides negotiated for a couple of days and ultimately settled over the weekend, which allowed Darian Mensah to ultimately enter the transfer portal, and Duke dropped a temporary restraining order that prevented him from doing so. Ends up at Miami. It's kind of funny how that works, right? Like a couple hours after the lawsuit is settled, you're on Miami's campus for a visit, but that is college football in essence in 2026. A conference rival poaching the conference champions quarterback in the league. And I don't think we've heard a single thing from Jim Phillips about it.
Fascinating. The other thing is, my understanding is the contract didn't have a buyout because the contract was pretty clear. This is 2 years. You can't go anywhere. You sign this. You can't go share your NIL rights with another school. You cannot enroll in another school. So, John, ultimately, what do you think pushed this over the line for Duke to just say, hey, let's go ahead and settle? Was it just a subject of money? What is Duke getting all of this?
Well, it's a brutal break for Duke, right? And if you go back, more than a year, I think when they added Mensa from Tulane, and Chris and I were the ones who initially reported that record-setting deal, and I think people were like, "Wow, it's a lot of money for a guy who played 1 year at Tulane," but it paid off. They identified a guy who was a bit underrated, brought him in. They won an ACC championship, as you mentioned, put up huge numbers. And what's the reward? Well, they lose him at the very last minute in a way in which they cannot adequately replace him. But I think, Brandon, you and I did that story at CBSSports.com where we talked to a bunch of lawyers. And I think, part of it is that there's just a risk in going to court. There's a risk, A, that you could lose, which would open things up even more. But also, the behind the scenes of how did you get him initially? What were the contract negotiations? There's things that could play out, whether in discovery or in an actual hearing, that you might not want to be out there for the public to consume. And so, at a certain point, I think when you know that the kid is leaving, when you know that you cannot compel him to stay at your school, which multiple lawyers told us about, at a certain point it's gone. So what can you do? You try to get as much money back, as big of a settlement as you can, and try to show, hey, we will, try to enforce this contract, but some of this is out of our hands, and that's ultimately kind of how it played out.
I think this is what do you guys think this was somewhat similar to what Washington just went through with the Devin Williams and the LSU situation?
No, because Damon Williams had a defined buyout in his contract in a way that Darian Mensah did not. And also, to be frank, Damon Williams, like reporting on this behind the scenes, showed some remorse pretty quickly about choosing to enter the portal. Within 24 hours, he was calling Washington saying, I made a mistake. Darian Mensah entered the portal with the intention of transferring to Miami. There's a big difference there, and I think Darian Mensah was prepared to pay whatever settlement came of that. And given that there was no buyout in Darian Mensah's contract with Duke, because to be honest, like, why would Duke ever think he would try to leave, right? Like, you sign a record-setting deal, you think he's either going to go to the NFL or he's going to stay at Duke for another year. I don't think it was a realistic possibility at the time for them to consider the fact that they needed to put liquidated damages in their contract because, like, who would leave a $4 million contract? But that's what happened. Like, Darian Mensah is going to get considerably more from that from Miami now because the sport shifted so quickly. So I think a lot of people around the sport are going to learn a little something about writing contracts, but ultimately, this is a sport where players aren't employees, and it's very hard to keep them in the same spot despite having a contract because the players aren't employees. They're getting paid for their name, image, and likeness.
I think you just hit it on right there. It's as simple as that. I think any of these kids are practically be able to break any contract as long as they're not employees. The judges are going to see favorably in their issue, unless you're able to get a judge, like say with Alabama, with the basketball player situation there, where it's a booster, the judge. Now he's reportedly having to recuse himself, but it's just such an interesting dynamic these days with all these cases.
Well, and just to circle back for a second, to answer your point earlier, Brandon, like, why is Darian Mensah at Miami? Because Miami missed on multiple other targets. And so it got to that point at the end where I think, Chris and others were reporting like, all right, where does Miami go here? Because there don't seem to be a big name left in the market. And, ultimately, I think that helps prompt Darian Mensah to go into the portal knowing that there was a landing spot for him at Miami and they had a lot of money to offer. And so that's there was a game of kind of like moving chairs here, and ultimately Miami didn't have anybody at the end. And then that kind of, I think, prompts them to make a hard move at Mensah and comes together pretty quickly. But I think you'll see that continue to happen too, where people want these established transfer QBs. There's only so many of them to go around, and there's not one in the market. Maybe you help push one into the market.
We need to move on here real quick, but we need to move on here real quick, but just in 5 seconds or less, is Miami a top 5 team going into next season?
Yes.
No, I have questions about the offensive line.
Okay, fair enough. I think they're right on the borderline there with him. All right, moving on. College football playoff, as everybody knows, is going to stick with 12 teams. The SEC and Big Ten can't come to terms on what they want. SEC and all the other conferences, for that matter, want 16 teams. The Big 12 or Big 10, excuse me, still wants the 24-team playoff. We've been reporting on this ad nauseum, and then, of course, they're kicking the can down the road. What is fascinating about this all to me, guys, we've done so much reporting on this and talked to so many people over the last year and a half, yet then it comes out from The Athletic yesterday, oh, by the way, it's not the highest rated group of 6 champion that gets in the playoff next year. It's going to be the highest rated group of 6 team, regardless if they're a champion or not, is going to be in the playoff. I've had issues with the CFP and the way they've handled things throughout this entire process, even with the selection committee stuff always changing things. But what really upsets me is just the lack of transparency on exactly what the format looks like and what they're doing behind the scenes every day. It's an absolute, I wouldn't say travesty, but it's a mismanagement with so many of those people working on this that they, one, can't be transparent, but two, can't release the actual details once they have them settled. It could completely creates mistrust between the CFP and the fan base, and for that matter, the CFP and journalists like myself. So I'm putting it out there. I'm very upset with the way the CFP's handled all this, and I think it's just an absolute mismanagement and it's very unprofessional, in my opinion, in the way they've handled all of this and not being transparent with all the issues and the information that should be freely available. You're not telling people what the playoff format's going to be next year. You've got group of 6 athletic directors going, oh, that's the case going to next season? That's what we agreed to? Horrible job. These guys get paid a lot of money and they don't know the difference between their butt and a hole in the ground.
I love that we're getting spicy Brandon today. I like that you had to get that off your chest.
It's ridiculous. What are we anyway? I need to do a better job as a reporter, I guess. That's the point, I guess. All right. Much more college football insiders after this. Hey, it's CFI. Doesn't that sound cool and catchy? We're back. We're going to get into just the craziness that the transfer portal is all the time, but specifically, we're going to look at the classes that have really been built. But we really want to spend this segment on LSU snagging the number 1 class, as many would have expected, with Lane Kiffin from Ole Miss going down there and having a barge full of money there off of the Mississippi River to spend. And of course, their latest addition, their biggest addition, one might say, is the number 1 offensive tackle in the country in Jordan Seaton, who left Colorado. And by the way, had Colorado create like a hype video with the understanding that was to announce that he was returning to Colorado. Instead, he uses the hype video to put his own voiceover over it to say that he's leaving the school. So not good business, but hey, whatever. Guys, success for Lane Kiffin? Is this his first offseason win getting this type of class? Sam Levitt from Arizona State. So many great pieces here. Is this a class that can win right away next season?
Well, first I want to say CFI sounds like we're on like some CSI kind of like spinoff, and appropriately, I think you could see some like murder wounds in Ole Miss from Lane Kiffin on the way out with what he's done with his transfer portal class. Lane Kiffin and his staff have been very, very aggressive this cycle in the portal, and this is what they had to do, to be frank. I think they have the number 1 class for a reason. They spent a ton of money to do so. John and I think, both think this roster is a $40 million roster or more for the total cost of it. And I think it creates immediate championship expectations for Lane Kiffin. There is no buffer period for Lane Kiffin going to next year. This is what they had to do. But when you look at Lane Kiffin's salary and you look at the cost of this roster, he is going to have more pressure on him than a year 1 head coach than almost anyone in history. That includes somebody like Kalen DeBoer replacing Nick Saban. Like, Lane Kiffin has been given every resource this offseason to go win a championship, and that's what he's going to have to try to do next year. Otherwise, it's going to get very warm for him very quickly.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about it, I completely agree with Chris. Like, this is why you hire Lane Kiffin. He is the portal king, self-proclaimed, but is very good at it, specifically that style of recruiting. So that's why you hire him. That's why you give him the resources. I mean, I think they have multiple players that are going to be in that top 3 in terms of compensation at their position. I think Jordan Seaton could be top 3 paid player in all of college football based on some of the numbers that Chris and I have heard to this point. So there's significant investments. What I think is interesting, and I made this point even before the portal class, but I think it is renewed now, kind of coming off what Chris says, like, Lane Kiffin has not had significant pressure on him as a head coach, probably back to the USC days. It's not to say he hasn't had pressure along the way. Working for Nick Saban as his offensive coordinator, not the easiest job in the world. But at Ole Miss, the expectations were not outrageous. Like, just making the playoff was one of the greatest accomplishments in school history. Like, that is now the bare minimum accomplishment that needs to happen for him at LSU. So it'll be very interesting to see how he handles that level of pressure that he just frankly has not had to deal with in a very long time, as he's kind of made his long, kind of circuitous journey back to being at a premier blue blood program at LSU from where he was at USC to here. So that is going to be interesting for me to see how he handles that. But I think he did a great job of adding talent, and now let's see if he can get the most out of it.
Yeah, he's done a great job, obviously, of we talk about being the portal king, but getting those pieces together and making it all work. Because as we know, It's not very easy. If you got the money, you can go out there and get big pieces, put them all together, and then I'm going to say there's several programs out there we've seen, Florida State, where you bring those type of guys in and they don't buy in, they don't get all together, and then everything falls apart very quickly. Lane Kiffin's never had to deal with that. I mean, I would say the most controversial, weird thing in season that's happened with Lane Kiffin was them losing at home against Kentucky a year ago, and yet that still galvanized the team. Were able to go down the stretch and still be in the playoff hunt, even though they didn't make it. But then this year ends up getting there. And by the way, credit to those players once again to fighting without Lane Kiffin and all that going on and getting pulled so many different directions to go into the playoff and win a game and be right there at the end with Miami. Who do we really like in this transfer portal class for LSU? We all know Sam Levitt. For me, I'm going to go with Jace Brown, the receiver from Kansas State. I really like that kid. I think that's a name to watch going into next season in this offense. What about you guys? What we got?
I mean, it starts at the top. I know you said we all know these guys, but like the investment, I don't think it can be stressed too much how much investment went into getting Jordan Seed and Princewell from Ole Miss and then Sam Levitt. Like that is $8 million at least between those three players. And I think that might be on the low side. So those have to be your foundational pieces of the roster. I think TJ Daugherty coming over from Ole Miss is a really important piece for them. He was a starting linebacker for them, multi-year starter, really productive player. Alou Ball coming over from Maryland, starting right guard, somebody who can step in right away and alleviate the pressure on that offensive line because that was the bugaboo for LSU last year. There's a lot of pieces. Like it's a very, very expensive roster. I mean, Hassan Longstreet is probably a seven-figure backup quarterback. Like you don't see a lot of that. Like they have him in the room. Like there's a ton of guys on this roster who are going to make a difference next year. And it is undoubtedly the best portal class. It's just whether all the pieces can come together and actually produce wins in the SEC.
I mean,
Look at the schedule. Yeah, go ahead, John.
No, you got it, Brandon.
No, I was just saying, you look at the schedule, week 3 at Ole Miss for that showdown. I'm sure everybody can't wait for that. Then you see their toughest games there coming down the stretch. Alabama and Texas, both at home, and Baton Rouge. You can be sure Lane Kiffin's going to be pushing for that to be night games. And then they end the season at Tennessee and at Arkansas, which I kind of think Tennessee might be a little bit down next season, especially with some of the issues at quarterback. In Arkansas, you have no idea. They're completely rebuilding that roster with 3-star kids, and that's going to be very difficult to do from the transfer portal. Is if anything less than 10 wins at LSU an absolute disappointment? Should 10 wins be the bar for LSU fans?
I think so. But I do think, I mean, you hit on them there. I think there's those two different 2-game stretches where it's Ole Miss, Texas A&M, and then Texas, Bama. That's going to make or break the season in my mind. And you've got to win at least half of those to get to that 10-win mark that you mentioned. So, I mean, they're going to have, from my understanding, and, you know, I think Chris, agrees with me, like a top 5 roster in terms of, how much money they've invested. So if you're putting in that level of expectations, if you're going through all that you did to hire Lane, all of the outside noise, all of the negative headlines, like I do think like it is playoff or bust for him in year one, which again is a lot of pressure. But that schedule, I think it's doable, but they're going to have to win some hard games against some other really talented teams. And Texas is another one that has gone all in of this portal class.
If the Dodgers and the Yankees don't make the playoffs, it is a failure. If LSU does not make the playoffs next year, it's a failure.
That's a great comparison. And week 1, we get Clemson LSU. It's the transfer portal king against the tamper king. Dabo Swinney absolutely hates this new era of college athletics, not wanting to really play in the transfer portal, and for that matter, calling out Ole Miss for tampering. It's a wild time. It's going to be two polar opposites in a lot of ways of the new era versus the old era in that week 1 game. We're not talking about Dabo Swinney this week on the show, but I'm sure we got a lot of takes on that we can get into on later episodes.
You better not talk about him too loudly. You might spend 15 minutes at a press conference coming after you.
True. That's true. It's entertaining. It's definitely entertaining. And Dabo Swinney and the things he said and is alleged to against Ole Miss, and for that matter, what's going on in college athletics. It's nothing new. It's just he's the first one speaking out loud about it, and I wonder if anybody will follow suit in the future. I think it's going to be very difficult to do. Okay. All right. Well, we're going to come back after this break. We're going to talk about more transfer portal classes, especially the ones that we really like that maybe you're not talking about quite enough right after this. Not everybody has to be number one to have a good recruiting class, and that's especially true in the transfer portal. Just ask Indiana over the last couple of years. Then again, they've got, arguably the best coach in college football that we've seen since Nick Saban was around. And sorry, Kirby Smart. But if you look around these transfer portal classes, there's a lot to like, a lot of teams to like that maybe we're not talking enough about. So we wanted to get into the transfer portal classes that maybe aren't getting enough sunshine on them, and really kind of dive deeper into why we like these teams. We're each going to provide some teams that we really like with their portal class hauls, and some of them very, very large. And so, Chris, I'm going to hand it off to you to start off with what might be the largest, or at least one of the largest transfer portal classes in this season.
Yeah, I mean, like a good basket of cheese fries at Eskimo Joe's, right? Like you just keep digging and there's more at the bottom, like the more to scoop up, just more to consume. Like that's Oklahoma State's class. I think everybody knows the people at the top. Drew Mestamaker, obviously, the five-star quarterback. Wyatt Young, Caleb Hawkins, his two kind of star running mates at running back and receiver, guys who were top five nationally at their position this year in terms of production. Those are the obvious ones. But if you keep digging in this class, like that Oklahoma State front office and coaching staff did an excellent job. This was a total teardown at Oklahoma State. They knew that going into it. You had to rebuild the foundation, and I really like what they did. I'm going to point out two positions, but I think you could apply this to the whole roster. Defensive line, they added a ton of really intriguing pieces. Their defensive coordinator, Skylar Cassidy, likes to rotate heavily up front. Maybe not necessarily one star, but they have a lot of like really good players coming in, like Jerry Lawson from Louisville, James Williams from Florida State. Anai White, former Texas A&M five-star recruit, was at Penn State. He's going to switch from defensive end to three tech. I think that's going to be a position for him where he could really thrive. Like a lot of important pieces. And then on the offensive side of the ball, if you look at receiver, which is a key thing in Eric Morris's system, they built their roster like a basketball team. Like you look at their top players in the portal, like Wyatt Young at receiver, Chris Barnes coming over from Wake Forest, two slots. But you also have Justin Bowick and Israel Polk who can play on the outside, two borderline four-star recruits. So I really love what the Cowboys have done.
John, I know you got a big team, maybe not necessarily a big transfer class, but a blue blood team that you really like.
Yeah, I don't know what the food analogy is here. Maybe more Wagyu beef. They're going for the top end stuff. But, I think Texas clearly went, big game hunting here. And I think they identified some key pieces that they had to, get better at. Cam Coleman, I think, is, certainly one of the biggest ones, the Auburn transfer, who I think, was never really able to see his full potential at Auburn, in part because of quarterback play, but really excited to see what he looks like with Ryan Wingo and Arch Manning in that offense. Hollywood Smothers, the running back who was committed to Alabama, flipped to Texas. That was a big blow for Alabama, huge gain for Texas. He's an electrifying running back. I think he can, really do a lot. They also added Raleek Brown from Arizona State. So really, I think upgrading essentially that position. And, the one big question that I have, and I think what might define some of what Texas did here, is that, they certainly put some investment in the offensive line. I think that was a problem for them a year ago. We've all probably saw Arch, at times running for his life. So that's a position where I feel like was a major disappointment, and they, added quite a few players there. Is that enough? Did they retool that offensive line enough? Didn't get Jordan Seaton, got some maybe like lesser known guys, but added quite a few. That I think will be super interesting. But I like what they did, certainly at that kind of high level, and it feels like it is a title or bust season for Texas, and certainly they have invested financially in that manner.
Yeah, I'm going to go right now with the defending national champions Indiana, which, in any previous year ago, I'm going to go with defending national champion Ohio State, the transfer portal class. Like, oh, well, yeah, of course. But you look at Indiana's previous transfer classes under Kurt Signetti, very heavy on the group of six spectrum, as we all know. But this is their heaviest yet from power conference programs. And yet it's their smallest transfer portal class yet as well, with 17. the last time I checked. They got 12, I believe, transfers coming in from the Power Four level. That's more than 70% of that haul for them. Previously, we were talking like 10 to 15% of their hauls were Power Conference teams. Of course, a large portion of that were the 13 James Madison transfers that follow Kurt Signetti to Indiana. But you look at the guys they brought in. Michigan State receiver Nick Marsh. He's a guy that probably is going to come in and immediately maybe be their number one receiver after them losing guys like Elijah Surratt. And then you look at Joe Bruner coming over from Wisconsin, the offensive line. He's going to be able to play, I want to say, anywhere along the offensive line. He could play two different positions potentially for them. And then Boston College running back Turbo Richard, who averaged, I think, a little over 5 yards per carry last season. This is a guy that is going to be able to come in and immediately be plug and play as well. And that's what, obviously, Indiana wants. All that, and not to mention the name we've talked about since the day he decided to leave TCU and go to Indiana, and that's Josh Hoover, the quarterback, who has thrown for nearly 10,000 yards in his 3-year career there at TCU. And now he's going to Indiana to be the next big thing for them. You know, they came in there with Curtis Rourke, was fantastic in year one. This year you get Fernando Mendoza over from Cal, who ends up winning the Heisman Trophy and was by far the best quarterback in the country, one could say. And now you get Josh Hoover, who's just a simply production machine. I mean, I know I think I rated Indiana number 8 in my way too early top 25 ranking, and I was getting crap over it because a lot of people I didn't figure a lot of people are putting them in their top 3, top 5 next year, but they just lose so much of that core players last year. But they're still a playoff team, in my opinion, based off of some of the guys they've got coming back, especially on the offensive front. And then, just Kurt Signetti's eye for talent. You got to give him the benefit of the doubt, really. And maybe I didn't give them too much of the benefit of the doubt there. Maybe this is already a top 5 team, potentially. Circle back here, Chris. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, I think the best way to think about Indiana is 2 years ago, they were taking the best players from G5 rosters. Now they're doing the same thing to Power 4 rosters. That's like the way they've upgraded in the portal. They're taking people like Nick Marsh instead of James Madison's best player. So when you think about Indiana going into next year, I think you certainly have to consider that their upper level of their roster, the talent on that roster, is going to be better than it has been in years past. But if you're talking about another roster and another transfer portal haul that I really like, it's Kentucky. If you're looking for a food, just like a big bowl of mashed potatoes, because you want the beef and kind of potatoes up front, and Kentucky had the best offensive line in the transfer portal. They had the number 4 offensive tackle in Lance Hurd coming over from Tennessee, the number 1 center in Colton Price coming over from Baylor, and the number 1 interior offensive lineman, Tegra, coming over from Ohio State, a multi-year starter. You wouldn't expect Kentucky to have the best transfer offensive line haul. And that's what they have. Cutter Leftwich, their offensive line coach, and Will Stein and Joe Sloan have done a really nice job loading up there. But you can pick out pieces across that roster for Kentucky in the portal that they did a really nice job with. You can tell the spend was considerable for Kentucky. They've invested in a way they haven't in the past in the portal and in their roster overall. And I think Kentucky's going to be considerably more competitive than they have been in recent years under Mark Stoops because of the way they've invested in the transfer portal at some of these spots. A lot of it's going to come down to what Kenny Minchie is going to look like, their likely starting quarterback coming over from Notre Dame. But I think if people remember, Kenny Minchie came very close to beating out CJ Carr in fall camp this year. Like, he is a guy that Notre Dame considered an upper level P4 starter, and Kentucky has that guy. I really like the Wildcats class.
Yeah, if there's one guy you could trust with quarterbacks, it's Will Stein and everything he was able to do there at Oregon. I have no worries about that. And Kentucky, most definitely. They're a roster I really love going into next year as far as just a year one rebuild going in. And quickly for me, I have another team. When we talk about food, James Franklin stealing from Penn State's plate as he left that program, getting fired there, goes to Virginia Tech. Nearly half of his transfer portal haul comes from his old job at Penn State. And not just that, you can say, hey, whatever. But this is a Virginia Tech pull here. So I think it's the highest rated transfer portal class they've ever had. They're inside the top 20, or at least they were at one point. And this is a roster I wouldn't necessarily say he's going to be able to win 9 games next year, but they should be a bowl team potentially. And James Franklin has shown his consistency with coaching and also in building rosters. And galvanizing those guys. I mean, heck, you bring back the former head coach to coordinate everything. I mean, you are just absolutely, I think we're going to be talking about James Franklin probably like week 10 or so going, oh, is he coach of the year material in year one? And, who knows, maybe Maybe we'll get Penn State and Virginia Tech in a bowl game. We'll see. Okay. All right. Well, we're going to bid adieu to Chris and John after this segment. We're going to bring in Richard Johnson and Shahan Jayaraja to talk about hot seats and teams to watch going into the 2026 season. So we're back on CFI. Richard Johnson, Shahan Jayaraja joining us now. Guys, what are you doing in 7 months?
I know what I'm going to be doing for the next 7 months. It's going to be a lot of sleeping after how long this dang season went.
Well, in 7 months, the college football season will be back. Thank God. But it's a long time between now and then. But that's not going to stop us from discussing coaches already on the hot seat, teams that are going to be very interesting to watch as they rebuild and potentially surprise next season, and then teams that are in very interesting spots from the standpoint of high expectations that maybe haven't quite been reached under relatively new coaches and whether they can break through going into next season. So these are the teams we are keeping an eye on as we go through this offseason and then kick the ball off in 7 months. I'm getting very depressed saying that. 7 months. Okay, so Richard, I want to start with you. Who do you really have your eye on going into the offseason and next year? Why, and what do you see in the future for them?
Well, I have it's in a negative bent. I will say I'll go with mine. It's Georgia Tech. Georgia Tech has been a really special story with Brent Key over the last few years. Haynes King has been an absolute folk hero in college football that came so close to knocking off Georgia a couple years ago. And then, quite frankly, pretty close to doing it again this year. They have been a tough out. They've been able to win as an underdog. But now I'm taking a look at how Brent Key transitioned into the next era of Georgia Tech football. Offensive coordinator Buster Faulkner and a host of offensive assistants are no longer on this staff. Many of them have gone to Florida with Faulkner as offensive coordinator. Haynes King, I think, is out of eligibility, even though it's college football. And you never really know if anybody's out of eligibility. And backup quarterback Aaron Philo followed Faulkner to Florida. So there's been a lot of tumult there. They're changing over defensive coordinators as well at Georgia Tech. And I'm just really curious about how Brent Key pivots this in kind of Georgia Tech 2.0 under him, and if he's able to remain the reliable, tough out and the thorn in Georgia's side as the in-state rival.
What you got, Shahan?
I think for me, look, there's so many teams around the country that I'm curious about. I'm curious about the group of five level, who's going to kind of emerge after the top of that group all left generally for Power Four opportunities. But I'm going to stick with two programs. We talked about Virginia Tech and James Franklin in the last segment. I'm going to take us back to Penn State, though. Penn State made a bold decision by buying out James Franklin and moving on from him after 14 years. And after a little bit of a tumultuous coaching cycle, they did settle on Matt Campbell. And Campbell's going to be in an interesting spot at Penn State because, first of all, he obviously has the expectations of getting over the top and taking Penn State to Big Ten title contention and to national contention. The thing that's interesting about him in 2026 is that he was able to bring over essentially a ready-made roster from Iowa State. This was a team that was expected to be a contender in the Big 12 in 2026, led by quarterback Rocco Becht, who also is on campus. But you're also talking about players like tight end Ben Bramer, who is a big-time player, like receiver Chase Sowell coming over, who was a former East Carolina transfer. So this is a really talented group, but also one that hasn't had this kind of expectation. They've been able to be a nice team in the Big 12 for a long time. Now we're going to see whether Matt Campbell's able to elevate and ultimately compete for the Big 10. One other team, though, that I want to mention is I want to also mention BYU. Of course, Kalani Sitake turns down Penn State, which leads to Matt Campbell getting that job. But Sitake's teams over the past 2 years have been one of the most underrated in college football. More than 11 wins over the past 2 years, I think 23 overall, bowl victories as well. They play Notre Dame early this year, and they got some great news earlier this offseason when running back LJ Martin committed to come back to BYU, along with, by the way, quarterback Bear Bachmeier and linebacker Isaiah Glasker. All three will be All-America contenders in 2026. So the question question becomes, can BYU elevate? Because they've had a little bit of a ceiling, right? They haven't been able to beat the very best of the Big 12 and make the playoff. Well, Texas Tech is going to still be really, really good next year. Will they be able to break through and ultimately make it to the postseason as well?
Yeah, sticking along those lines, a team that a lot of people have been talking about quite a bit, and we actually talked about earlier on the show, I'm really keeping my eye on Oklahoma State. I think this roster, bringing in more than 50 new kids, a transfer portal class, I know it's a matter of putting them all together, but there are some very familiar faces, a lot of faces from North Texas, who they followed Derek Morris over to Stillwater, and a lot of those pieces are from the offense. And you look at the class, there's 5 blue chip additions here, led by, of course, 5-star quarterback Drew Mestemaker, and then also they've got 3 4-star receivers coming in, and then also a 4-star running back who follows them from North Texas as well. So there's some familiarity there, and also a roster which, let's remember, if you look at that roster last season under Mike Gundy, I would argue is maybe one of the worst, 3 bottom worst in the power conferences, roster-wise, just looking at the talent. Plus, they had injuries at quarterback. So I think this Oklahoma State team in year one can compete in the Big 12 and maybe win 8 games next season, and maybe even challenge for 9 if they get some breaks here and there, if this team can come together. Because, again, yes, it's a lot of new pieces, 50-plus new guys, but most of them come from North Texas, where they've already played under Eric Morris, especially at the key positions at quarterback, running back, and also along the offensive line and at receiver. So I really like this Oklahoma State team going into next year. I'm also going to focus on 2 other coaches who are at big-time programs at Blue Bloods. I'm going to start with one that I believe is on a warm seat, and that is Kalen DeBoer at Alabama. I've got big questions about the Crimson Tide going into next season. One, do I feel solid about their quarterback situation after Ty Simpson leaves and they completely whiffed in the portal? No. Do I feel good about their running back situation after Hollywood Smothers goes from NC State, commits to Alabama, and then says, nah, I'm not coming to Tuscaloosa. I'm going to go to Austin, Texas, go play for the Longhorns? No. I don't have much confidence or much positivity in my heart right now for Kalen DeBoer, as great of a coach as I believe he is, in going into this next season in year 3 for them. Alabama, I believe, was not a playoff-worthy team this past season. I said that on Selection Sunday before the announcements were made. I thought Notre Dame, this whole argument over Notre Dame-Miami, should have been Notre Dame over Alabama. That should have had Notre Dame and Miami both in there. Yes, I know Alabama won a playoff game against an Oklahoma team that doesn't have an offense, by the way. But this Alabama team finished with 4 losses this season. They're a roster that should have been in the playoff, but did not play like a playoff team. And I'm going to tell you right now, there is no identity left with this Alabama offense. What are they? To me, they're more finesse team than one that can be able to run the ball and win games against you. They can't run the ball. They can't do the things that Nick Saban did in the past. Forget those comparisons with Nick Saban. The fact of the matter is this Alabama team has been soft mostly under Kalen DeBoer, and they ain't going to cut it. He's got to get them playing hard-nosed football going to next season. But here in the early going, after losing 4 games this season and not belonging in the playoff, I have not been impressed with what they've been able to do in the portal and convincing kids to come in there and make them hard-nosed, because they're all saying, no, I don't believe it. I'm going to go to Texas, like Hollywood Smothers. I've got issues there. And also Kyle Whittingham, real quick with him in Michigan. I think that could be a surprise story. I say surprise, it's a blue blood. But they could be a team that here in week 10, week 11, we could be saying they're still in the Big Ten race. I'm a huge believer in the culture he brings into a program, the stability. But also look at all the pieces they managed to bring back, led by quarterback Bryce Underwood. And my biggest addition among any assistant coach in college football this season has been offensive coordinator Jason Beck, following Kyle Whittingham from Utah to Michigan to take over that offense. Imagine what they could do if he's able to develop and get Bryce Underwood to buy in that system. That could be a top 15, top 10 type of offense. And if you get that at Michigan, you're talking about a Michigan team that could be in the playoff hunt down the stretch. So I really, really like those guys. Anybody else out there? Anything else kind of piquing your guys' interest? Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in. I want to echo what you're saying about Michigan. I mean, I think that's a huge spot for them. I'm going to point to Oklahoma as well. This is a prove-it year for the University of Oklahoma. If their offense doesn't come along, like, you just have to start writing obituaries about what that unit's going to be. You have to start making major staff changes, including at offensive line coach. This is the year that all has to come together. We know what they can do defensively, offensively. With John Mateer back, it is time.
All right, guys, we're heading to our last segment and tell you some storylines that we're going to be watching in this offseason that might dominate the conversation, that might be a little bit different from previous offseasons in college football right after this. In past off seasons, the calendar was pretty predictable. We would be preparing right now for in about a week the National Signing Day Extravaganza, which used to be the biggest day in the off season anywhere, but that's gone, and no more people are paying attention to the transfer portal. Then, of course, we look to spring football. We look at the depth chart. Who's going to fight for this spot? And that's become less and less important these days because at the time, rosters weren't completely fully developed. And then also, a lot of coaches are getting rid of their spring games. We're not even getting to get the fans out there to watch games. But this offseason could be a little bit different. And so what we're going to talk here real quick as we exit the show, the storylines we're going to be watching, the stories that we could see develop. And I wanted to start real quick, guys, if we could start off from here real quick. I think we're in an era here now where, especially this offseason, we're going to see more lawsuits than ever, similar to what we're seeing with Duke against Darian Mensah, trying to block him from being a transfer portal addition for Miami. And you might ask, why is that the case? Transfer portal's closed. Because I'm telling you, so many coaches out there are worried that players that are on their roster today in the spring might go, I'm leaving the school to go enroll elsewhere. How can they do that, you ask? There's no transfer portal window in the spring. Exactly. And some students, some players out there are going to challenge that and say, you can't stop me to continue my career somewhere else and enroll somewhere else. And you're going to see some other issues with lawsuits potentially there as well. What do we think, guys? What are we going to be watching this offseason?
Along those lines,
I think this is going to be.
I think the eligibility crisis right now in college basketball is going to rear its ugly head in some way in college football. You're seeing the Charles Bediako situation right now with Alabama. That the ruling on that is going to take a little bit because the NCAA's lawyer couldn't get down to Tuscaloosa because of the weather. So he's going to play, I believe, tonight and then probably will again this weekend. And we'll come back to that next week. If you don't think this is going to show up in college football, I think you're kidding yourself. I think a lot of people in college football are looking at how this either resolves or doesn't in college basketball to see if we will have a similar situation in August, for instance, with a player who either washed out of the UFL or made a practice squad roster in the NFL and couldn't make a final 53.
Yeah, I'll close it out with one that's on the football field. I think this is going to be the summer of Curt Cignetti. We're going to be asking ourselves, who is the next Indiana? Who is the next Curt Cignetti? And we talked about a couple of them on this show, right? Programs that transferred a lot of players from their previous stops, whether it be Penn State with Matt Campbell, whether it be Eric Morris bringing most of North Texas roster, whether it be Auburn as well, bringing a bunch of players from South Florida with Alex Golesh. This is going to be a dynamic that I think a lot of people are going to be watching, and we're going to see the success rate. If this is ultimately something that works for a lot of teams, expect to see even more programs look at what's on Group of Five teams rosters when they make their next hires.
Yeah, that's the thing. I think a lot of programs, and a lot of us have written about this, is like people copying the Indiana blueprint, but a lot of them have looked at that and just said, we've really got to focus more on our front office, our scouting, and being guys that just fit us and not chasing stars. Because as you guys know, in the recruiting world, I can't tell you how many times a player would hit big and all of a sudden be offered by one Power 5 program, be their first Power 4 offer, and then within 12 hours, they'd have 5, 6 more Power 4 offers without them ever really seeing the kid. It was very much a cat and mouse game, everybody chasing the same thing. So people are changing a little bit, and that's going to be fascinating to watch this upcoming season and off season. Much more college football available on our YouTube channel, CBS Sports. Make sure and like and subscribe to this video if you're watching on YouTube, and check us out at cbssports.com.